But I'm excited again to be here today to talk about some of the interesting things up here in Northeast Indiana. So Indiana is comprised of a diverse landscape that ecologists today recognize as 12 distinct natural regions. And each of these natural regions, and some of the natural regions I should say, are divided further into sections. And these sections and natural regions are based on, am I in your way, bud?
You're great.
Are based on things like the geology that underlies those areas, the flora, the fauna, the climate, things that make each of those sections or natural regions unique from the other sections or natural regions within the state. Our state's flora is also very heavily influenced by the floras of other regions of North America. And so if we think about Indiana's flora, we think about the influence of the prairies that are more common to the west of Indiana. We think about the deciduous forest that covers a lot of Indiana, but is also very common as you move further east in the United States. We have some species that we consider boreal relic species that occur further north in the northern woods of Michigan and Wisconsin, but hang on here in Indiana. We have influences from the southeast and the southwest. We have influences of the Appalachians reaching in to southern Indiana, as well as influences from the Mississippi embayment reaching in from the southwest into Indiana. And then we also have some species that we consider to be either having an affinity to the coastal plain of the United States, so to the Atlantic Ocean coastal plain or the Gulf of Mexico coastal plain, or species that have the core of their ranges along the coastal plain, don't occur inland and occur up here in Indiana, so we consider them disjuncts from the Atlantic coastal plain. So all of those pieces come together to form our present-day flora and what we see on the ground. But to better understand our flora and our natural communities and the natural regions that form Indiana, we have to think back actually more than several, millions of years to see how Indiana was formed. And so we think of our substrates, our bedrocks especially. And so we think of limestones and sandstones and siltstones and shales that formed millions of years ago in places that are not on the globe where Indiana sits today. But those areas over millions of years experienced the plates shifting and moving, they experienced earthquakes, they experienced sediment deposits, and that ended up with Indiana where it sits on planet Earth today with those bedrocks that we have, those limestones, sandstones, siltstones, and shales. But that's only part of the story. The other part of the story has to do with our glacial history and our climate over the past several 100,000 years. And so we have to think back about 220,000 years to when Indiana's first glacial period, when it was sitting where it sits today on the globe, happened. And this was called the Illinoisan Glacial Event. And that Illinoisan Glacial Event, again, started 220,000 years ago, and that glacier, that large sheet of ice, advanced onto Indiana from the north and covered about 4/5 of the state. So Indiana at that time probably looked something like this, when the only place that wasn't covered with ice was this little finger right in here. Everything else was covered with ice for about 110,000 years until 110,000 years ago. Our climate warmed, that glacial ice sheet started to retreat back to the north, and Indiana was free of ice for a period of time until 70,000 years ago, when our second glacial advance happened, and this was called the Wisconsin Glacial Event. And during that time, 70,000 years ago, again, our climate got really cold, and another sheet of ice advanced over most of Indiana, covered about 2/3 of the state, and stopped right about there. And so that sheet of ice covered Indiana from 70,000 years ago to about 13,000 years ago when the climate started to warm, and that pushed that sheet of ice back north up to where the glaciers exist today up in the Arctic. You can really see how those two glacial events in the last 220,000 years shaped our natural regions. Again, this was the area right in here that was not covered with ice 220,000 years ago. And so that left this southwestern lowlands natural region and southern bottomlands natural region, which was covered by ice, and this bluegrass natural region, which was covered by ice. But in between them, the Shawnee Hills natural region and the Highland Rim natural region were not. So we have this almost vertical arrangement of the natural regions because of that ice sheet covering those two lobes on the east and west of the Shawnee Hills and the Highland Rim. And then 70,000 years ago, when the ice advanced down to here, you can see how that affected the landscape because we have these very irregular shapes that are based on where the different lobes of that glacier advanced to and the moraines that they left. when they retreated back, the soil piles that they left on the landscape. And so these glacial events really affected what we see in our natural regions today. As that last ice sheet retreated 13,000 years ago, when the climate warmed, the flora changed along with that retreating ice sheet. So initially, it was still really cold, and the ice was retreating away, and Indiana's flora was largely tundra vegetation. You can think of Indiana looking like a tundra. It's kind of incredible to think that. As the climate continued to warm, some conifers started to move in, especially spruce. We can look back at the pollen records and see that spruce was a dominant tree in Indiana back at this time as the climate started to warm. So we had a spruce-dominated landscape. The climate continued to warm. Those spruce couldn't tolerate that, so they got pushed to the north, where they sit today up in Michigan and in Wisconsin. And the deciduous trees started to move in. The things that we see today as our deciduous trees started moving in, to the point that they became the dominant landscape until a period of about maybe 9,000 years ago to 6,000 years ago. And during that 3,000 year period, we had really hot and really dry weather climate in Indiana. And this was a period of time known as the hypsothermal period. And so during that hypsothermal period, with the really hot, really dry climate, droughts were very commonplace, long extended droughts. And you know the trees can't really tolerate drought very well. In addition, those droughts led to fires advancing across Indiana. So when that happened, those deciduous trees got pushed to the east, and the prairie from the west moved into Indiana and covered much of the northern part of the state for that period of about 3,000 years. Well, then the climate started to cool again, and precipitation increased, so it got moisture here. When that happened, the Native Americans saw those effects of that fire, and they said, hey, we want to manage this land in a way that we can more easily hunt our food, and we can more easily see our enemies coming. So they started to use fire in a way to manipulate the landscape to keep those areas as prairie that would have otherwise reverted back to forest as the climate was cooler and moister. And so they kept some areas open, small pockets of prairie throughout the eastern portion of Indiana. But when the colonists first arrived in Indiana, what they saw was this expansive prairie in this grand prairie region, mostly forests throughout the rest of the state, glades and barrens down in the southern part of the state, wetlands scattered across the landscape, fens and bogs, and the things I'll talk about moving forward. So that's essentially what's happened in the last millions of years, just condensed down to a few minutes, to help us understand what our flora looks like today and why it looks like it does today. So today I'm going to be focusing, though, on Northeast Indiana. And when I'm talking about Northeast Indiana, I've arbitrarily assigned this 15-county region that's outlined in red here to be Northeast Indiana. And you can see that Northeast Indiana falls into three of these natural regions. This is the Northern Lakes Natural Region, the Central Till Plain Natural Region throughout much of the central portion of the state, and the Black Swamp Natural Region. And I'll talk a bit about each of those, but I just want to kind of show you this Northeast Indiana region again. So I'm considering Northeast Indiana, you can't read those counties, I'm sure, but Northeast Indiana extends up to the Michigan line at the north, the Ohio line to the east, and I've got Elkhart County in the northwest corner, down to Grant County in the southwest corner, and Jay County in the southeast corner, for what I'm defining as Northeast Indiana for the purposes of today. So this Northern Lakes Natural Region, as you look at this region, it's this brownish colored, wedge-shaped region in the northeast part of the state. And you can see it's very well defined by these topographic lines that show up on this map. And these topographic areas are some of the moraines that were formed by the lobes of the Wisconsin glaciation event. And so there were three lobes within the Wisconsin glaciation event that formed this Northern Lakes Natural Region. There was a Lake Michigan lobe that came in from the northwest, which eventually led to the formation of Lake Michigan. There was an Erie lobe that came in from the east that eventually retreated back and formed what we now know as Lake Erie. And there was a Saginaw lobe that came in from the middle of those. And you can see where those three lobes of the glaciers came together, and we have these morainal features. And so this is considered the Maxentucky moraine. This is considered the Packerton moraine. And then these couple of moraines right in here are the Mississinewa and the Salamone moraines. And those four moraines form the boundaries of that Northern Lakes Natural Region. So again, this was at the intersection of those three lobes of the Wisconsin Glacier. This part of the state has really deep soils. Because of all those lobes of the glaciers coming together, depositing all that soil as they retreated, some of the soils within this Northern Lakes Natural Region are over 500 feet deep before you reach the bedrock underneath them. So really deep soils. And as a result of these really deep soils and this glacial activity, we have these glacial lakes that formed when large chunks of ice got trapped within the glacial material and then melted and formed the lake, or that it got trapped within the glacial material, melted, and then the ground collapsed and formed a lake or a basin situation. So you have these glacial lakes that are interspersed with knobs, with cames, with valley trains, and with outwash plains that form our Northern Lakes Natural Region. And all of this comes together to form a really interesting assemblage of natural communities. We have bogs in the Northern Lakes Natural Region and fens in the Northern Lakes Natural Region. Within Indiana, if you want to see bogs and fens, this is the place to go. It has the greatest accumulation of those two unique wetland types. If you're not familiar with bogs and fens, a bog is a wetland that's situated within a basin, so you think of like a bathtub where water can really only come in from runoff from the surrounding areas. It doesn't really enter via groundwater, though we do have some that have some groundwater influence as well. But they're really in that depressional basin-like situation. They're often acidic, sometimes they can be a bit more neutral. Fens, on the other hand, are systems that have a groundwater influence to them. They're often on shallow slopes. Sometimes they're adjacent to lakes or streams or creeks as well. And these areas are very often calcareous, but sometimes they're more neutral and they can even be acidic in the case of poor fens. So we have bogs and fens, we have these glacial lakes that form in the way that I talked about that are really common in this Northern Lakes Natural Region. That's where it gets its name. We have marshes, which are wetlands that don't have trees in them. These are often around the perimeters of some of these glacial lakes. We have prairies ranging from wet prairie to mesic prairie. Many times these prairies weren't expansive like we had in the Grand Prairie region, but they did still exist at the time of European colonization. Sedge meadows, unique wetland types that are dominated by sedges and often have some groundwater influence as well. Swamps, which are wetlands that have trees in them. Seeps and springs. Wet sand flats, which are pretty unique communities and wet muck flats that occur, and I'll talk about some of these in a bit, that occur in these glacial lake basins as well. And then a variety of forest types. Dry mesic upland forest. Mesic means moist, so a dry mesic upland forest isn't the moist soils. It's a little bit drier, but it's not as dry as a dry upland forest. So it's sort of intermediate there. Think oak hickory with dry mesic upland forest. But also mesic upland forests, think beech maple in that situation, and a variety of floodplain forests as well. So all of these different natural communities come together within the Northern Lakes Natural Region. And on top of that, this is a place where we find a lot of these coastal plain disjunct species. They occur in these wet sand and wet muck flats around the perimeters of some of these glacial lake basins. The Central Till Plain Natural Region forms this huge area, the largest natural region in Indiana, throughout the middle third of the state. And within northeast Indiana, we're really talking about this this Bluffton Till Plain section of the Central Till Plain Natural Region. There's a very small portion within the Tipton Till Plain that's in northeast Indiana. We're going to ignore that because it covers just a tiny corner of Grant County. So within this Bluffton Till Plain of the section of the Central Till Plain Natural Region, as you look at this map, you'll see these almost concentric lines, which are moraines that formed as that Erie lobe was retreating back after it had reached its furthest extent. And so the glacier would retreat a bit and would drop a bunch of soil, typically sand and gravel. Retreat a bit, drop a bunch of soil, sand and gravel. And it continued to do that. You can see the remnants of that on this map with those concentric rings. So I mentioned the northern boundary of this natural region being the Packerton Moraine, the Mississinawa Moraine, and the Salamoy Moraine. And the southern boundary is this moraine that runs through here. This is the Union City Moraine, and it's bordered to the east by the Fort Wayne Moraine. So again, this Central Till Plain Natural Region was formed during that Wisconsin glaciation event. Within the Bluffton Till Plain section, we have what we consider a topographically homogeneous terrain, which doesn't mean that it's flat. It just means that it's flat and then a ridge, and a flat and then a ridge, and flat and a ridge. So we have these valleys that are cut through by these moraines. Because this area was once covered by ice and once covered by a lake, essentially, the soils here are primarily clay. And so they're very poorly drained. So those valleys in the bottoms oftentimes are colonized by flatwoods natural communities and by swamp natural communities. These places where water accumulates, trees can still grow there, but they're generally wet situations. And then in between those are the mesic upland forests that are located on those moraines. But there are still some bogs, fens, marshes, and natural lakes within this, the bluff and tiltplain section of the central tiltplain natural region. And then the last natural region that encompasses northeastern Indiana is the Black Swamp. It's a small area up here. This is much larger as you get into Ohio. The Black Swamp extended well into Ohio. And as you can see, the Black Swamp is bounded by that Fort Wayne moraine. And so the Black Swamp was formed again during this Wisconsin glaciation event. And it's the western lobe of the lake plain of proglacial Lake Maumee. So as the glacier retreated, it formed those moraines, and the last moraine it formed was at Fort Wayne Moraine. And then the ice started to melt and form water. And the water started to fill up that lake, and it was blocked by that Fort Wayne Moraine as a natural levee. The water continued to rise as that glacier continued to melt, and eventually it reached that natural levee right about here, and there was a torrent of water that eventually formed what we know today as the Wabash River. Well, as that Wabash River formed and that water flowed out of that natural levee, the rest of the levee remained intact. And so we're left with that Fort Wayne moraine, but the water drained down from that lake to a point that the ground was still very saturated. The soils in this area are largely clays and silt loams. And so that resulted in a swamp habitat covering most of this Black Swamp natural region, and again, extends well into Ohio. There is still some mesic upland forest, especially on that Fort Wayne moraine and in some rises within the Black Swamp, but largely this was a swamp. And unfortunately, within Indiana, we really don't know what we had in the Black Swamp natural region, because as soon as the colonists could convert that to agriculture, they did, because it was great soil for farming. So there could have been some rare plants that were unique to this region, but we really don't know were there. All right, so now let's get into talking about some of the natural areas that occur in Northeast Indiana. And it was extremely difficult to cut down the number of sites that I wanted to talk about. You can tell already I'm going to be long-winded, and this would have been a several-hour talk, and I stuck with my initial list of sites that I wanted to talk about as natural areas in Northeast Indiana. I had a really hard time, but I cut it down to 10. So I'm going to talk about 10 sites in Northeast Indiana. And I chose those based on a variety of reasons. I wanted to spread them geographically across Northeast Indiana, so I took that into account. I wanted to choose generally larger sites. I didn't want to choose really small sites to talk about. There are some that are a little bit smaller, but mostly larger sites within Northeast Indiana. I wanted to choose sites that had unique natural communities to talk about, and I picked sites that have public access, so that if any of you are interested in seeing some of these places and you haven't been there, you can look them up and visit these places at some point in the future. So the first one I'll talk about is Balsall-Leonard Woods Nature Preserve. This is located in Adams County, and the red stars are going to show where these sites are within Northeast Indiana on each of these maps. This is a 40-acre property, so it's not very big, but it's a pretty unique place. This is a site that's owned by the Indiana DNR Division of Nature Preserves. So I'm going to talk about all of these sites I'm going to talk about are dedicated nature preserves. They're dedicated by the Division of Nature Preserves as some of the best places in Indiana. But not all of them are owned by the Division of Nature Preserves. Some of our sites are owned by land trusts, like the Nature Conservancy or Acres Land Trust, or Little River Wetlands. Some of them are owned by municipalities, by counties or cities. Others are owned by different divisions within DNR, the state parks, the Division of Forestry, the Division of Fish and Wildlife. So we work with all these different partners, and to date we've protected, I think it's 302 nature preserves in the state, covering over 55,000 acres. We continue to add to that year after year. But this is a site that's owned by the DNR Division of Nature Preserves, and it consists of an old-growth mesic and wet mesic flatwoods forest. So what that means is we have topography that's relatively level, but there are these small undulations. And in the slightly drier areas, we have oak and hickory dominating. And in the slightly wetter areas, we have some of the wetter oaks, like pin oaks and swamp white oaks, as well as cottonwoods and sycamores dominating the landscape. And we end up, you can't see it real well in this photograph on the screen, but there are pockets of water through here, especially in the spring, that are vernal pools that are excellent for amphibian breeding habitat. Blue Cast Springs Nature Preserve is located in Allen County. It's owned by Acres Land Trust, and it's about 90 acres in size. Not all of that is dedicated as state-dedicated nature preserve, but the best parts of it are. There's some young forest as well. The parts that are dedicated as nature preserve consist of flatwoods forest and floodplain forest. You can definitely see the water right over here in this flatwood, so these little pockets of water that are vernal pools. There's also a really wonderful display of wildflowers, spring wildflowers at this site in these flatwoods. So if you want to see some good wildflowers in the spring, you might go to Blue Cast Springs Nature Preserve. The drier portions of these flatwoods are dominated again by oak and hickory, typically white oak and shagbark hickory. And then in the floodplain habitat, there are a variety of trees that you would expect in floodplains, like silver maples, sycamores, willows, and cottonwoods. And buckeyes as well are very common at Blue Cast Springs. Okay, we're going to move up into Elkhart County, and this is one of my favorite nature preserves. I'm going to say that a couple of times. This is one of my favorite nature preserves in Northeast Indiana, but I have a lot of them. Boot Lake Nature Preserve is owned by the Elkhart County Parks, and they own about 270 acres, and we dedicate a portion of that as state-dedicated nature preserve. And this is just a wonderful place. If you're there during a wet year, what you're going to see at the end of this boardwalk is a lake. You're going to see aquatic plants. You're going to see white water lily and spatterdock and water shield and purple bladderwort. But if you're there either during a dry year or late in the season when the water levels have dried down, this is what you're going to see in that lake basin. The water dries down and those marsh species from the edges fill in over this muck and sand flat habitat. So this is a kettle lake, it's a depressional lake that during dry times fills in the muck vegetates with particularly these coastal plain disjunct species. So this place is dominated by species that if you were to go to the east coast of the United States, along the coastal plain of the Atlantic Ocean, you would see some of these plants like tall beak rush and long-beaked beak rush and dwarf umbrella sedge. These are plants you probably haven't heard of, many of you, but they're these annual, in many cases, annual sedges that fill in these muck habitats, and they're things that don't occur if you get outside of northern Indiana until you get to the coastal plain of the United States. It's really an incredible phenomenon that we have these things at all. And the idea behind how we got them is there were these short distance dispersal events by birds, where they would pick them up either on their feet or through their digestive systems, move them a short distance to an appropriate habitat, and those plants would live there for a while. Over time, they would do another short distance dispersal. This is over long periods of time, not short time. Do another short distance dispersal to another appropriate habitat. Eventually, they made it all the way to the Great Lakes region. Well, since that time, conditions have changed. Naturally, conditions change to where those appropriate habitats that are inland are no longer appropriate habitats for those species, so they no longer exist, but they still exist up here in the appropriate habitats in northwest and north central Indiana. Really incredible that we have them. I'm getting into more than I was going to talk about, but I love these plants. They're genetically isolated from the main portion of their range, so I feel like at some point, maybe not in our lifetimes, maybe not in our kids' lifetimes, at some point they will be described as new species. Because they're genetically isolated, they're going to change because they can only interbreed with that genetics that they have within this specific region. So we're going to see new species described that are endemic to the Great Lakes region that are these coastal plain disjuncts. So it's pretty cool too. So this is the best part about Boot Lake, but there are also shrub swamps that are dominated by buttonbush. There are upland forests that are mostly dry mesics or oak hickory type forests. And there's a prairie planting as well that you can walk through. So the Cedar Creek corridor, I couldn't choose a single site within the Cedar Creek corridor to talk about, so I lumped a bunch together and called it the Cedar Creek corridor. You can see how I lumped them when you look at the ownership here. It ranges from DeKalb County down into Allen County, runs along Cedar Creek, and most of this work has been done by Acres Land Trust, but they've worked with other partners as well to protect these properties along the Cedar Creek corridor. So Acres, Isaac Walton League, the Nature Conservancy, Girl Scouts, Allen County Parks, and there are some private properties still that Acres is working on acquiring that make up about 1,400 acres along Cedar Creek. Really an incredible corridor. And it's full of exciting plant communities. So we have these upland forests that are largely dry mesic, so oak hickory forests in the higher areas and on drier soils within the Cedar Creek corridor. And some of those are old growth forests as well. We have floodplain forests that range from being mesic floodplain forest, where you have beech and maple growing along these streams or creeks, all the way to wet floodplain forest, where it's more sycamore and willow dominated. We have swamps, which are, again, forested wetlands that have species like pin oak and swamp white oak in them. Shrub swamps that are largely dominated by buttonbush and swamp rose. We have circumneutral seeps, areas where skunk cabbage is common on low hillsides and then also in some of the bottoms. And in some of these cases, these circumneutral seeps are even fen-like, where we have species like poison sumac, swamp thistle, swamp betony, all growing together in these seeps. And then there are even these hill prairies that occur along the Cedar Creek corridor. And so these hill prairies are really exceptional places. You can see the steep slope here. And on that slope, we have species that you would typically find in a mesic or dry mesic upland prairie. Things like blazing star, things like prairie dot, some of the prairie grasses like big bluestem, little bluestem, and Indian grass all occur in these small but really impressive little hill prairies along Cedar Creek. So that Cedar Creek corridor, these organizations have really done a fantastic job in protecting a really impressive corridor along Cedar Creek. Douglas Woods Nature Preserve, this is largely protected by the Nature Conservancy. There are some private properties involved as well. This one, I said that I picked properties that were open to the public. This one might not be open currently to the public. It had been in the past. I think it's closed temporarily. So you may not be able to visit Douglas Woods currently. But it's located on the Steuben-DeKalb County line. There are properties on both sides of that county line. And it makes up about 1,400 acres in total. So it's a very large, for northeastern Indiana, chunk of land that's protected by, mostly by the Nature Conservancy. Within Douglas Woods, we have a variety of upland forests, these being both dry mesic, so oak hickory, as well as mesic, so beech maple forests that have lots of good spring wildflowers. Some of these forests are old growth as well, so you will find some pretty large trees at Douglas Woods Nature Preserve. There's also floodplain forests dominated by silver maple. There's swamps dominated by buttonbush, or swamps that are dominated by the wetland trees, and shrub swamps that are dominated by buttonbush. And there is some pond natural habitat as well at Douglas Woods Nature Preserve. There also are a couple of species that we consider to be boreal relic species. So these are things that occur further north, up into Michigan and Wisconsin more commonly. And they're barely hanging on down here in northern Indiana in places where the climate is still cool enough for them. And some of those species occur at Douglas Woods as well. And the Spurgeon Woods Nature Preserve in Noble County is owned by Acres Land Trust. It's about 65 acres. A large portion of that is dedicated to the state-dedicated nature preserve. This is a fabulous place for spring wildflowers as well. If you go there in the spring, you'll see a great diversity of wildflowers. It's dominated by upland forest, but the upland forest here is primarily mesic upland forest. So we have beech, maple, and tulip as the dominant trees, with some red oaks as well. Those are up on the higher ground. On some of the slopes and down towards the bottoms, we get these circumneutral seeps where you can find lots of skunk cabbage and spring cress, things like that growing in these circumneutral seeps. One of the interesting facts about Edna Spurgeon Woods is that it has these glacial deposits that are called kames. So a kame is a mound of soil, typically sand and gravel, that was left by the glaciers, basically where it was pinched by two different parts of the glacier, and the soil filled in as it came off of those glaciers and formed this mound, and then the glaciers moved away and left that mound of soil. So we see these mounds, or this knobby topography, very commonly in the Spurgeon Woods Nature Preserve.